This is our panel on the international scene, and quite appropriately, every one of our three panel members has got jet lag. John came from Saudi Arabia, Erik came from London, and Michael came from Beijing. So they're all in different time zones, and what more appropriate way than to start a panel on the international side of autonomous vehicles and so on. Gentlemen, the panel is yours.
Great, thank you so much. It's been quite a fascinating day. It's also been quite an Americana-centric day, and in some ways an LA-centric day. So this is the time we're going to open up the discussion a little bit to see what's happening elsewhere around this planet. And great participants, panelists. Dr. Erik Antonsson is the CEO of aiPod, which is a secretive startup in Pasadena. Erik is amazingly distinguished career. You were CTO of Northrop Grumman. You were at Caltech for many years. You taught at Caltech. You were also at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory up in Pasadena. Michael Dunne is one of the great experts in the world on a very, very important subject that will be increasingly important in the years ahead, which is the Chinese automotive industry. And if you haven't woken up to it, you will in the coming years. So it's absolutely wonderful to have you both here, Erik and Michael. It's a little bit of a bifurcated discussion because on one hand, we're going to talk about global cities and Beijing, Dubai, London, coming back to LA. And the idea that, as I think was said throughout the day, the mobility revolution is really about, is an urban story more than anything else. Our planet has been rapidly urbanizing over the last decades. And if we think of China, which when Mao Zedong, not too long ago, I mean 2 generations ago, China was 20% urban, 80% rural, and now that's, it's now over 50% urban. I mean, that's unprecedented in the history of the world, is it not, that movement of populations? But let me start perhaps with you, Erik, because aiPod has an absolutely fascinating business model where you are an autonomous vehicle, an autonomous driving company, but you're not involved in making cars themselves autonomous. Perhaps just tell us a little bit about what you do,
Sure.
Because it is really quite fascinating and important.
Thanks. Delighted to have the opportunity. There were a lot of themes that have been expressed throughout the conference today that are just right down the center line of what we're doing. The discussion in the city panel about city integration and the need to work closely with cities in recognition of their key role in both enabling and being challenged by mobility and congestion and a variety of policy goals there. But you're right. We've looked at this space and how to address the challenges of mobility, particularly in the urban environment, and realized that vehicles are important, but they are a piece of the puzzle. And right now there are companies, OEMs in particular, making vehicles that are adaptable. And so we'll be adapting vehicles. And so the idea that we're adapting vehicles for the urban autonomous mobility service and building a network of those vehicles is where we're positioned. And to work closely with cities. So we're city integrated so that we're sharing data in return for the permission to operate on their streets and pick up and drop off passengers on their curbs. So it's a mobility proposition, and in the early going really aimed at last mile mobility. Again, these are all themes that we heard from other panelists today, but we're building a business around those ideas.
But Erik, how do you deal with the fact that cities in a way are like human beings? You have men, you have women, you have tall, you have short, you have big, you have thin, etc. The DNAs of cities vary so much, and if we live here in LA in a broad distributed city that's huge, that is the size of a country. It's the size of an Israel, for example, sure. LA County. Other cities in Europe, for example, have dense medieval cores, right. Or Chinese cities have another kind of topology. So how does that complicate your work at aiPod? Because, cities are so different one from the other.
Yeah, great question. We've found, and we've been talking to cities around the world, not in Asia to a great extent at this point, but certainly Northern Europe, the UK, North America, their objectives with respect to mobility are consistent. If we talk to the transportation leadership in any of these cities, we come away with the same policy objectives. They are trying to reduce congestion, reduce pollution, increase traffic pedestrian safety, and provide economic access to their residents. Those themes are consistent, no matter whether it's a European city that has a very dense central core and then the density drops off as you get to the outskirts, or if it's more like Los Angeles where it doesn't have the same kind of dense core, but it's more distributed. We also were learning things about the character of cities, just as you asked, John. At first glance, you would think that London and Los Angeles have nothing in common. Well, I've already described policy goals as being in common, but surprisingly, they are the same size, and by size, you can measure it a couple of different ways. They're both greater metropolitan area, 20 million people. They're both essentially the same size geographically. And so the congestion problems are really very similar. Yes, London has a dense core that LA doesn't. LA has freeways that London doesn't. London has a truly world-class transportation system with the tube and the overground rail and indeed their whole rail network. Los Angeles doesn't. Los Angeles has freeways. And so the congestion problems have some character, and so we'll have to tune the solution we provide for each city, but broadly the needs that our system will be addressing in partnership with the city are the same.
But you have such cultural differences, too. I mean, we were discussing that a little bit earlier, and as Peter Drucker used to say, culture eats strategy. And the Europeans, for example, I mean, a resident of Copenhagen has a very different attitude towards private car ownership and to public transportation than perhaps his or her counterpart here in Los Angeles.
Yeah.
So they're very, very different,
absolutely
approaches.
That is true, and we see that, and that's part of the reason that our first pilot and why we've been generating so much interest and traction in the UK is culturally they're much more used to sharing mobility, riding trains, riding shared transit, black cabs in London being another example of that, than we are here in the States. And so the populace is much more ready and open to the idea that mobility will be shared. I don't think anyone doubts that, it already is. But now the idea that there'll be an increasing degree of autonomy up to the level of full autonomous operations is not scary there the way it is here, because that kind of shared mobility where systems convey you from one place to another in the city so you don't have to worry about the details is part of the cultural fabric. We believe there are great opportunities here in the US as well, in North America generally, because the urban problems are consistent and the congestion problems are also consistent with those problems. But as you've pointed out, there's a cultural challenge that will be greater for us to overcome here to get acceptance. We believe we can do so. We believe that the value proposition of what we'll be offering will convince people that that's much more convenient to press a button, have a vehicle arrive, doors slide open, get in, takes you to your destination. That value proposition will be so great, and the price at which it will be available will be so low that it will gain traction in the US as well.
Just one other question, that is, have you looked at the big crowded metropolises of the global south, the Jakarta or Rio, and I mean, those certainly present challenges for the kinds of technological changes that we're looking at.
Yes, great question. We've been encouraged to take a look at Jakarta, in fact, but have not had the time to really be able to dig into it yet.
Can't be everywhere.
We have done some initial analysis of Singapore. It is a city that's open to AV operations.
Very open.
Very open.
Yeah.
And so that's obviously a target for us. But we've got our hands full with Northern Europe and North America and the UK, which for a one-year-old startup feels pretty good.
Michael, the view from China. I mean, it's I guess in the car world, it's on everybody's lips and thoughts that this country that no one ever thought would be a player in this field is, wow, it's just huge. I mean, it staggers the imagination. Talk a little bit about that, and perhaps Because I think there isn't a general understanding for really what's coming down the pike from China in terms of AVs, EVs certainly, but also relating to what Erik's been talking about, are there differing topologies of Chinese cities, different approaches in, let's say, Chengdu or Guangzhou or Shanghai, et cetera? So why don't you start in telling us just about the Chinese auto industry and what's coming?
Thank you. First of all, maybe share a story from just last week while I was at the Beijing Auto Show. I had the opportunity to accompany the CEO and chairman of a major U.S. auto show making their first visit to China and making their way through the Beijing Auto Show, overwhelmed by the number of models. It's the largest auto show in the world by far now. We were speaking earlier, there's over 140 Chinese electric vehicles on display. That doesn't count electric vehicles from the global automakers. Just a massive show. So after 2 days, I asked the chairman of the auto show, based here in the United States, city not to be named, but you can imagine, what do you think? What's your takeaway from seeing all this metal in one place? And he said, what's my take? My take is America has no idea what's about to hit them. And you start looking at the numbers. This year, if we produce 90 million cars globally, 30 million in China. 1 in 3 cars built on the planet will be built in one country, China. You go, okay, well, that's 30 million, but they're probably cheap, under $10,000 cars. No. Largest premium market by a factor of 2, twice the size of the US market, China. Mercedes, BMW, Audi sell twice as many cars in China today as they do in the United States. Largest electric vehicle market, it'll be up to 1 million vehicles this year. Largest ride-hailing, by far. Didi books something on the order of 25 million rides every single day. Didi's the
Chinese Uber.
Chinese Uber. So if you just look at those numbers and you put Chinese flag above the American flag, well, they're largely twice our size at this point. And the reason he said people maybe in America haven't woken up to or not ready for this is it's largely been contained within China up until now. That period is over. And my number one takeaway from the auto show is that every Chinese automaker I spoke to had plans to enter and compete here in the United States within the next 3 to 5 years. So suddenly all that power and might which has been limited or contained within the Chinese market is going to find its way to our shores, and it's time to get ready for that.
And then within that, there's, of course, Xi Jinping, the Chinese leader, has made it a national goal to be number 1 in electric vehicles, autonomous vehicles. Ridding Beijing and Shanghai from pollution is a national goal now. So they're getting really, really good in EVs, and that's really what's the shape of cars to come. Is that not true?
That's right. Not only on the low end, BYD and other Chinese auto manufacturers have proven themselves able to build EVs for under $20,000, but also interestingly, you see the emergence of companies like NIO and Byton, who are Tesla fighters. NIO, by the way, happens to have an office in San Jose with 500 employees doing advanced autonomous electric vehicle research, connectivity research, hiring the best talent in the world. I've visited the company a few times. Maybe many of you have too. I encourage you to do so. You walk in there, nothing about it says Chinese auto company. Yeah. It's global. And so they're there.
Now, the last time I looked, there was a little bit of trade friction between President Trump and the Chinese, and over things like steel and stuff like that. I mean, cars are a big deal.
Yes.
So what is your prediction? Where is this heading? I mean, is this going to exacerbate the putative trade wars that we have, or what's going to happen?
Well, it comes at a very interesting time because on the one hand, the Chinese want out. They want out. They called China outbound. They want to compete in the United States and Europe and other markets around the world. They need to because they have excess capacity at home. The market at home is slowing. Margins are falling. They want to come out. Yeah, they haven't needed to export yet. Now they do. At the same time, American companies have largely been shackled in China. It is true Ford, GM, and Chrysler sold 5 million cars in China last year. But what's not really well known is that 98% of those cars were built in China in 50-50 joint ventures, which the Chinese largely control. So it's a regulation. Automakers going into China must form joint ventures, and a foreign company cannot own more than 50%. So essentially, GM, Ford, and Chrysler are Chinese companies building American cars inside China. That's
well, that sounds like a level playing field.
Right.
Not, yeah.
So it's right for our administration to call this out and demand that if you want access to the U.S. market in the future, you better open up.
How will this play out in the AV universe? The Chinese Baidu, which is, of course, the big Chinese search engine, is also the #1 in autonomous vehicle technology. It's created the Apollo autonomous platform in China. I mean, it's a very open source platform, of course. Google here has our search engine has Waymo. Are we going to see a world in which, an autonomous world in which there's one that's kind of a Chinese AV universe and another is kind of an American AV universe? How is that going to play out, do you think?
I think you got it exactly right. There'll be, the longer I lived in China from 1990 to 2015, and having come back here to the United States 2.5 years ago, it's two systems. China has developed its own Google, Baidu. It's developed its own Uber, Didi.
Right.
It's developed its own, you can run down the line, they said, we don't want to integrate or have we want to do it our own way. So look for China to set standards, and this is where it gets really interesting. As China increasingly is already the largest market in the world, guess where the money goes? And they start to set standards. They may be the first to set standards, and then automakers around the world comply with Chinese standards, not American standards. So suddenly we find ourselves in a challenger mode rather than defending as the champion. But to answer your question, in the immediate term, I think it's going to be a U.S. system and a Chinese system competing for supremacy. No real integration.
Well, Erik, how do you see this sort of playing out from your point of view? The sort of Chinese-American. Does it concern you? Does it keep you up at night? Or?
Oh, heavens. Keep me up at night. The strength in R&D investment in China is significant. And something that I think in the United States, as has been pointed out here, in terms of leadership, we ought to be paying attention to. What the right way to approach it is, I think, another question. Certainly there are unfavorable trade practices that need to be addressed, but it isn't entirely clear to me that having an adversarial posture with a country that is so powerful economically is a winning strategy in the long run. So I'm not suggesting I have answers here, but it is a complex and challenging area for us, I think, as a nation, but one that I think really demands that we address it and focus on it with a clear and honest perspective. In the autonomous world, I am somewhat less concerned than I am in some other areas. The university strength in the U.S. Is still preeminent. It is true that Chinese universities have come a long way and are continuing to strengthen. But there are still, I think, distinct advantages that we have in the United States. I think that it's probably true that there will be parallel systems. I'm not so sure that that's all bad. So it's a complex situation, and I don't have the depth of understanding that I would really need to have a deeper view on it.
Let's talk for just a second about the different regulatory environments in China and in the United States. In the United States, of course, so much of the regulation around autonomous vehicles is at a state level.
Right.
So there are 50 different jurisdictions. And then there are sort of city issues, of course. China is much more top-down, much more monolithic, I gather. I'm not an expert. So one often feels in the United States that although we're developing very well because of the universities, these core technologies, it's sometimes difficult to test them here. China, the day after the crash in the tragic crash in Arizona, whenever it was, 2 months ago, I think China kind of said, gee, we can test very freely here, and no restrictions, et cetera. And that's does give them a foot up, does it not?
In particular, because they can test, the Chinese can test at home now, they can also test here, and they can take their knowledge of what they learn here back behind protective walls in their own market. And on top of that, regulators, it's no secret to everyone here, I saw it firsthand while living there. If Xi Jinping, the president, decides tomorrow the highway that runs from Beijing to Shanghai is autonomous only, done.
Yeah.
No discussion. Zero.
But of course, much of the world actually does function that way. I mean, I lived for quite a few years in Paris, wonderful city, but politically it's very top down. I'm not saying it's like China, but I often say that the mayor of Paris, as I think many people know, has decreed, for example, that the main artery of Paris, be closed to cars from one day to the next, or that as of next week, on Mondays, Thursdays, and Saturdays, only cars with even license plates can travel because of the pollution levels. And I just think, if Mayor Garcetti decreed, well, we'll just close the 405 tomorrow, we'd have a revolution. So we live in a wonderful democracy in the United States. It's very messy and complicated, et cetera, but it really is, it's somewhat more bottom up. Mm-hmm. And that, there are issues associated with that. I don't know, Eric, would you like to talk to that, or Michael?
Just on a lighter note, and many of you may be aware that Peppa Pig, anybody familiar with Peppa Pig? Winnie the Pooh?
Yes.
Winnie the Pooh, okay. Winnie the Pooh, Peppa Pig might be UK. They're both banned from the internet in China. Okay, so...
And as they should be.
As they should be.
Yes.
And the company that was responsible for distributing Peppa Pig images has hired no less than 4,000 new employees to censor their own material so they don't make another Peppa Pig mistake. So if you wonder about the extent of control in China, it's getting stronger and tighter under the new president. Last fall, he told everyone in the country, from east to west, from north to south, the party leads everything. So what we're seeing is a very interesting dynamic in China. After 25 years of decentralization and reform, it's moving in a different direction, in an unexpected direction of a lot of control. What does this have to do with AV? They have made this policy called Made in China 2025, where they set out specific targets to say our autonomous vehicle industry will be at this level with these many vehicles on the road. Very clear, and will lead the world in the technology. So we cannot underestimate the ambition and determination of China to lead in these future tech sectors.
Where does this leave Europe as sort of man in the middle? It'll be difficult for them to kind of go it alone with China if America's off in one side. The Europeans have a very, very strong car industry, of course, but then we see that, I guess this is the #1 Chinese automaker, Geely, has now bought close to 10% of Daimler and owns London Black Cabs and Volvo, of all things. How do you see that playing out, the European factor? Either one. Go for it.
Well, it was in a China context, so I'll turn to you for the start, and then I'll carry on.
I think it's fair to say that European automakers are genuinely nervous. On the one hand, they're extremely dependent on China for growth and profits. Volkswagen, which sold about 10 million cars last year, 4 million were in China. Mercedes, BMW, Audi, I mentioned earlier, sell twice as many cars in China as they do in the United States. So there's tremendous profits from that market. At the same time, they see, wait a second, unbeknownst to us, Li Shufu of Geely has acquired 10% of our crown jewel in Europe, arguably, Daimler, without our knowledge.
Which is Mercedes, of course.
Yeah. Mercedes. Without our knowledge. Yeah. They already have Volvo. I don't know how many are aware that Dongfeng Motors, which is another big state enterprise, owns 14% of PSA, another major European Peugeot Citroën.
Yeah.
Volvo's already been acquired, as has MG brand, the Morris Garage. Now it belongs to SAIC. So to a large extent, China's already deeply entrenched and has levers of control in Europe that are making European leaders quite nervous. Yeah. What to do?
Yeah, certainly all of that is true objectively. I think that Europe has some real advantages, though, that are characteristic of what we see in the United States. Very strong university system, but also they have the advantage of knowing they're not in the lead. And I think in this environment, that is a real advantage. We've seen a willingness for European cities to adopt really what we would consider here to be aggressive experiments in mobility, because they know their challenges are so great that they can't be met by existing solutions. And that's a real advantage, I think, to recognize that you have to step out of the normal regime of doing business and try new things. And it's part of the reason we've been getting such a strong acceptance in European cities is they recognize the challenge that they're under. I'll also say one other comment that I think is important, has been part of the theme of the conference as a whole. Someone said it earlier, maybe in the opening session, perhaps not in quite such stark terms, but the OEM's business model isn't one that is really well set, might even say it's not at all well set, to address the mobility market in cities. Their business model is to sell vehicles to individual owners. In fact, in the US, they can't even do so. They use their dealer network, and it's the dealers who sell them to us. So the OEMs have a very carefully protected niche, but it's one that makes it very, very difficult for them to be developing and selling vehicles that would be shared in the way that we're thinking about them being shared, in the way that cities are thinking about them being shared. That constraint is less true in Europe, although I still think the OEMs there are in the same kind of bind. But it means that other players, the tier one suppliers, the Bosches, the Densos, the Delphis, Aptiv now, in the automotive world, I think are very well positioned to be able to say, look, we could sell our parts to an OEM, or we could sell them to somebody who's assembling urban mobility vehicles, and as that transition takes place, they have a great market position. So I'm less, candidly, this is going to sound so arrogant, but bear with me, I'm less concerned about the posture and future of the OEMs, because they're really not positioned to be able to address the mobility market. More interested in other players, and again, I think Northern Europe has some very strong players who are well positioned there.
Right. Do the Chinese have, the Chinese equivalent of an Aptiv or a Bosch? Do they? Is it segmented in the same way as in Europe and the United States?
You know what, the reality is that most of the major component industry in China consists of tier one global suppliers.
Right.
So Bosch, Denso.
Got it.
Suppliers there too.
They're all in there because
Got it.
when the global automakers started assembling cars in the 1990s, they brought their own supplier base. So there are a couple of companies. One's called Wanxiang, another one who recently bought Key Safety Systems and bought Takata, called Ningbo Joyson, but there are only a handful of genuine Chinese competitors in that field. More so a case of global automakers ensconced inside China for decades now, with massive plants and tens of thousands of employees. They're looking to supply that same mobility sector in China.
Yeah, good. Before I open up to questions from you, I just want to ask you another question, Erik, and that is about, if you can answer it, about the work that you're doing in London, in Britain, and because it's quite interesting.
More government policy. UK, Northern Europe, most of the countries there have an overt national industrial policy. The UK certainly does. And through that, they run competitions to spur development in various areas, and autonomous vehicles is one of the areas. So there's an organization, part of the government in the UK, called Innovate UK, that runs competitions. It's perhaps a little bit like our DARPA, except it's really focused on developing industry as opposed to just doing basic research, We applied for and won an Innovate UK grant to run a trial of our mobility offering in the City of London, starting later this year. And so they're paying us to help develop our early demonstration of the business model. We'll choose an area of London, an outer borough of London, that is high, or actually low, I'm sorry, on what's called the PTAL scale. So the Transport for London runs all of the mobility trains, underground, above ground trains, as well as administers the black taxis. And they compute a score for every little region within the greater London metropolitan area called the public transit access level. Some areas are served very well. Where there's a corridor that's got a high-speed rail, for example, the PTAL score is very high because the access level is high. People can easily get to where they want to go. But if you look in between those rail corridors, you can see the PTAL score is quite low. And that's something that Transport for London knows they need to address, and it's part of the reason they're part of our team, in fact, is to try to find innovative ways to address the mobility challenges in these low PTAL access disadvantaged regions of the greater London metropolitan area. We haven't settled on a region yet that will be running this pilot because Transport for London is still looking at the options and evaluating them with us. We think in the next week or two we'll have one of those identified. We're beginning to purchase vehicles and get them fitted out with sensors and processors and getting them calibrated so that we'll be ready for the trial starting probably in the fourth quarter of this year.
Great, fascinating stuff. We have time for a few questions, so don't feel shy. Sir.
Yeah, I don't know if I need a mic.
Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate it. If I could be so bold as to actually ask two different questions, which I think might be interesting. But first question is in relation to shifting demographics when we look at the globe. We know that obviously China, when you talk about the demographics of the middle class, the emerging middle class, and the fact that their population now in the middle class sense exceeds that of the United States in many cases. So I'm just kind of curious how that impacts the future of the automobile, where you have consumer preferences and tastes, that there's more wealth now in some of these developing nations that are going to be looking for new products. And kind of the second piece to that, we've kind of shined the spotlight on China and Europe and some other areas. Just kind of curious if you have some experience in the India segment from the standpoint of India is a market, obviously, we know is kind of notorious for their lack of infrastructure and roadways and things like that. How does that impact the automobile? Obviously, Tata Motors and some of the impacts they've made kind of in the global market in automotive. We also know that India certainly is, there's a lot of technology and a lot of some of the brain drain that was happening. We're seeing now demographic shifts of that returning back to India to be part of the solution. So I know two kind of very different questions, but I'd be curious for the panel's inputs on that. Thank you.
Good question. Erik, Michael.
Jet lag, I'm sorry. The second one was India. First one was...
The aspirations
the demographics, sorry.
The vast Chinese middle class.
Yeah.
I think the way to phrase that is this huge new Chinese middle class, will they have the same kinds of aspirations regarding the kind of acquisition of cars, et cetera, that, the middle class that emerged in the United States after the Second World War, for example? Are we going to see that reproduced?
It seems like in China they like to refer to something called China speed. Everything is in life and reality is sped up, and in the space of 20 years, if it's possible, we may have already cycled through that aspirational period. So something that for 100 years it's been aspirational in the United States to own your own car. In China, I've seen it go from highly aspirational to today, actually there's a lot of inconveniences. Traffic's terrible in Beijing. They tell the joke last week that they say a guy's driving down the street. It's such terrible traffic in Beijing, arguably the worst in the world, that a guy's walking down the street, sees his friend, and he says, "Hey, where are you going? Do you need a ride?" And the guy goes, "No thanks, I'm in a hurry." Okay. That is that bad. So many of my friends in China are saying, actually owning a car, parking, insurance, the taxes you pay, the license in Shanghai to buy a car. Even before you buy a car, you have to buy a license to buy a car, and that's $12,000. So it's very expensive and not that joyful to drive anymore. So they may have already cycled through that period and said, we like the convenience of calling a DD at any time. So
Chinese teenagers don't have a kind of dream of the kind of the road trip.
Especially not in the coastal cities where they've already sort of ran through that. Maybe inland is still there, but on the coastal cities, educated urban elite are saying, Let me see. I'd like to try something different. And they're much more open to autonomy, much more open to ride hailing than owning their own car.
Well, I guess that's good for the planet.
Yes. Still, even so, they 28 million cars last year were sold. So it isn't like they're going away. It's just the pace is slowed compared to a few years ago.
And on India, I would say stand by. One of our advisors is well placed in India. I'll leave it at that. And has been giving us thoughts on how we might think about approaching that market. They have a history that's every bit as interrelated in shared mobility there as in Northern Europe, maybe even more so. And so I think culturally it'll be something where this will fit well. The infrastructure is a problem, and stand by.
Yeah, good.
Got one on your left.
On my left, there we go. Madam.
Yes, in the title you have LA to Dubai, but you didn't talk about Dubai, and we know that Dubai is hosting the World Cup soccer soon. So, how it's going to affect the AV technology, or it was just fun to put in the title? Thank you.
I can't speak for the choice of the title, but one of the members of our team is landing in Dubai today. We've been having discussions with several different groups there, government groups, transit groups, exploring options. We're gravitating to cities where they're eager for new experiments in mobility, and Dubai is certainly there. So their Expo 2020 is a place where they want to showcase new technologies and new capabilities, and that's an ongoing discussion. They, like London, have highly non-uniform access to public transit, well, like every major city, Los Angeles too. And so there are access disadvantaged regions of Dubai that they'd like to try to address. Apparently the region near the coast is well served and anywhere inland is not. And so innovative solutions that can address those problems for them as well as showcase technology for them are things they're interested in. So it's, I know I keep saying stand by, but I think over the next month or two we'll have a much clearer view of, is that a place that we can really seriously consider conducting a trial? What size and shape will that trial be like? What will the objectives of that pilot be like? So in a couple of months I'll be able to tell you more.
But Dubai will be an important place to watch because the leadership there, and it is definitely a top-down place politically. It has vision, it has wealth. We know it quite well. We do a lot of work there, and they in terms of autonomy, I think they want to make it one of the great sort of global poles of that.
Right.
Expo 2020, which is the big world expo in 2020, the state is spending, I think, $26 billion on this. I mean, it's going to surpass the Shanghai Expo. One of the main theme of Expo 2020 in Dubai is mobility, which will be interesting. So it's definitely a place to watch.
Right out front.
Sir.
Yeah, my name is Peter Barony. I'm with Faraday Future, another EV company. I have a question. It's more related to batteries.
Batteries.
So in terms of the availability, let's say lithium-ion batteries are going to be around for 10 to 15 years, who knows. But there's a limited supply of these materials, specifically cobalt, to a lesser extent lithium and graphite. And China, according to all reports, has a 90% monopoly on processed cobalt for battery-grade cobalt. How do you gentlemen see that playing out in terms of the competition for these OEMs to win the race to become the dominant EV players? Thanks.
That's a great question. I think, Michael, perhaps you would like to attack that one.
Right. Excellent point. China, as part of its strategy to lead in electrics, not just in volume, but in every aspect, supply chain, manufacture, design, development, including materials, sourcing materials, they want to lock it all up so that they, from upstream to downstream, they totally dominate the electric vehicle industry, have global automakers produce there. Tesla, you may have noticed, Elon Musk yesterday said, thank you, China, for opening up, signals that they'll probably go in. So China will be the place for electric vehicles up and down the value chain.
But I think the question was a little bit more, do Chinese manufacturers have an advantage because of their hammerlock on these rare earths, essentially? Cobalt, sorry, thank you, sorry.
It will be to their advantage,
Yeah.
but yes, so they will have an advantage, but even more so, it will force all global automakers to concentrate their production in China and everything that goes along with that.
Wow.
So of the 28 million cars that were sold in China, anybody want to take a guess? What percentage were imported into China last year? 28 million was the size of the market. What percentage were imported? 2. 98. So have no illusions about what China's ambitions are.
And those are all in Hong Kong, maybe? No, or,
Yeah, right. They all went to Hong Kong.
Yeah.
They're very high-end, typically very high-end.
Right.
Porsches, high-end Lexus, and then your Lamborghinis and Ferraris and such. But China wants it inside, and then if global Mercedes will start producing an electric car there in 2 years, as will Audi.
Yeah.
So just bring everybody into China, and then they have the tax base, they have the employment, they have the value chain. U.S. should respond, should have its own plan.
Okay, well, I'm going to start learning Chinese very quickly, I think.
Center of the room.
Sorry, there we go, sorry.
Thank you. Michael, 2 questions for you. First, does China impose the same 50% ownership rules and joint venture rules on the car suppliers? And the second question, and the more important one, is how successful or how thorough have they been in harvesting information from American and European manufacturers through these joint ventures to facilitate and move their own auto industry forward?
Thank you. First question's the easy one. The 50-50 joint venture, 50-50 cap on 50% cap on foreign ownership applies only to assemblers, not to parts makers. Second question, how effective has China been in capturing technology from their global partners? In China, they have this expression, it goes, 同床异梦, which means sleeping in the same bed, dreaming different dreams. This has been the nature of the Chinese foreign joint venture. Foreigners want to sell product into China. The Chinese want to grab as much technology as they can. It's been a dogfight, but over time, you imagine 20-year-old joint ventures, the Chinese are going to learn a lot, not only from their partner, but by working with tier 1 suppliers that are selling to the partnership. So the Chinese have certainly benefited from the JV relationship.
Good, I think we have time for maybe one.
Yeah, we got one here in the back.
Thank you.
Thank you. My name's Danny Beckman. I'm with Cruise Automation up in San Francisco. And I used to be a New Zealand diplomat based in Washington, D.C. And one of the most professionally confounding experiences of my life was dealing with the patchwork of state and local legislation and regulation in this country. And I'm interested in your thoughts on how we go about as an industry thinking about that problem globally so that we don't have a patchwork of regulations relating to these new methods of transport and new AV technology across the world.
We could speak for hours about that. That's I mean, that's a great question, and one that does have to be answered. Eric.
It is a great question. I think we'll probably approach it in the way that we've approached other technology developments of a similar sort, where there will be a patchwork inevitably. It is how innovation gets going. It isn't pretty, it's messy, but that's a strength. And then the best parts of it survive. You look at any of the regulations that exist that standardize electrical power distribution or appliances or any of the safety apparatus on vehicles. That almost always started as innovations that were done locally, and then the good parts of it, as a general rule, not always, are adopted more broadly. I think we're already seeing some of that here, where states are looking at other states and saying, gee, Arizona has this very permissive AV testing posture. Is that really the right one for us? Ooh, California has a very restricted AV testing posture. Is that the right one for us? Maybe we lose business if we have that. Maybe we expose ourselves too much if we adopt the Arizona posture. So I think there's some strength from the experimentation you see going on. And in particular, because this field is evolving so quickly, I think that's particularly valuable. It does make it tough for an organization that's trying to build opportunities and place trials and pilots and early deployments in multiple cities and multiple locations. But Northern Europe is no different. Denmark is very different from Germany, is very different from the UK, and then all 50 states here. So it's a patchwork, and we have to work through that until more consistent regulations come into play.
Of course, I mean, standardization is going to be so important to drive, certainly drive e-mobility. Mm-hmm. We simply cannot have multiple standards in EV charging and things like that. I mean, we really do need a global standards. I think we've come to the end of this really great discussion. I wish it could last for a couple more hours. I probably would fall asleep because I think we're all equally jet lagged. But I want to thank Dr. Erik Antonsson of aiPod, Michael Dunne of Dunne Automotive, and also all of you. Thank you very, very much for your patience. Thank you.